Kids Gig deserves some celebration too, right? So excited for Kids Gig. If you don't know, GIG stands for Growing in God. And every summer, hundreds of kids across all of our locations get to come and to get to be a part of this elementary age experience. And many of our students, our teenagers, get to serve in there as well. And it's just a phenomenal event that we do across our locations for kids to know, experience, and follow Jesus so much more. So for those of you who have served in the past, or maybe you're even thinking about doing it this year, thank you for making that possible. Thank you for those of you who give faithfully to your locations to make that possible as well. Registration for Kids Gig is going to open up on Easter this year. And so as you hear those announcements, I want to encourage you, get online, check out the dates for your specific location, and sign up soon. Sign up your kids and sign up to serve. It's really going to be a great summer. Well, this week we're in week 6 of this series called Around the Table, where we've been looking at how central the table is to the life and ministry of Jesus. When you walk through the Gospels, you see all these beautiful stories of him interacting around the table. And today we're going to get into John 12, and it's really a pivotal moment in his gospel. But before we even do that, I want to just take a moment and give a special shout out to a group of folks who are in the South Hills right now, who are gathered up as part of one of our watch parties in anticipation of launching a new campus down there this year. So for those of you who are gathered up at our watch party in the South, I want to say hey to you, hey to Garen and your whole team. Super stoked, super excited for what you guys have ahead. So thanks for joining us as they joined us for worship today, and they're joining us for teaching as well. So excited for you guys. But John 12. Okay, John 12 is really this pivotal moment for this gospel, because if you know the structure of how John wrote the gospel, he has these first 11 chapters. And in these first 11 chapters, that covers the life and the ministry of Jesus, and it covers the miracles. Or if you remember a few weeks ago, when Amanda taught on the wedding at Cana of turning water into wine, John calls them signs because there's something deeper behind them. And so he has these signs that he organizes the first part of his gospel around. John 1 through 11, it has these 7 signs, and they kind of ramp up in anticipation and intensity. So it starts with water into wine, and it culminates all the way up to the raising of Lazarus from the dead. That's kind of the first section that John wrote. The next section that he wrote, it's all about Passion Week. So more than half of John is just about the last week of Jesus' life. And Passion Week is where Jesus is heading towards the cross. So it records all kinds of things, including his betrayal and his arrest and ultimately his crucifixion. And sitting right between these 2 sections that John wrote is a really interesting and beautiful moment around a table that John captured for us. So this is how John's chapter 12 begins. He says this: 6 days before the Passover, Jesus therefore came to Bethany where Lazarus was, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. So they gave a dinner for him there. Martha served, and Lazarus was one of those reclining with them at table. Mary therefore took a pound of expensive ointment made from pure nard and anointed the feet of Jesus and wiped his feet with her hair. And the house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. As I've been reading through this passage a lot over the last several weeks now, you know what I can't help but thinking? I can't help but thinking of like peak 1990s TV sitcom with the opening credits that's always panning around, and you've got shows like Full House and Family Matters and Roseanne, and it's always the music and the credits, and it's showing all the different characters that you're about to watch on the TV show, right? You remember those sitcoms? I just kind of see that that's what John is doing here. He's kind of taking this like verbal camera of sorts, and he's panning around the room, and he's showing us all the different people, all the different characters that are in this story that are gathered around the table. And so what you see there is we have Martha, and it's a brief mention. We have Martha who's doing what we normally see her doing. She's serving. We've got Lazarus who's just been raised from the dead, and I kind of picture him just sitting in the corner like this. Like not fully understanding what's going on because I was just dead yesterday and now I'm having lunch. He's a little shell-shocked. Then you have Mary, who we see Mary doing what she's normally doing as well, where she's sitting at the feet of Jesus and she's just expressing her love to him. And so what is John telling with this story as he kind of has this verbal camera that he moves around the room? Well, he's telling a story about worship. He's talking about worship. He's talking about these individual people that, yes, they're sitting in some different physical spaces in the room, but really he's giving a different profile, that they're sitting in different spaces when it comes to worship. And so he's giving a snapshot of a worshipful moment right here between the miracles and the crucifixion. He gives this snapshot of what this looks like. And worship is one of those words where as soon as I say it, we get a bit of a trigger in our mind and we start to think of certain things. I think for a lot of us, we probably just think that it's what we just did a few moments ago, where we gather together and we start to sing and there's music, and that's what worship is. We sing praises to God to honor him, to give him glory. And yes, that is what worship is. But that's not exclusively what worship is. You see, in the scriptures, when we look at how God calls us to worship, we don't just worship on one day, and we don't just worship through music. We worship with our time. We worship with our relationships. We worship with our attitudes. We worship with our words. We worship with our resources, our money, our possessions. We worship with our obedience. That when you look in the scriptures, worship is so much more than just music. It's a response to who God is. But there's also a warning in the scriptures about worship, that we can take something that God has given to us, and instead of using it to worship him, we can turn it into something else. We can turn it into what's known as an idol. And that's a word too, that we get images in our mind of Indiana Jones grabbing a gold statue and running for his life. But that's not what idols look like for us today. In our Western culture, idols, they're just as accepted as they were back then, but they just look a little different. So for a lot of us, we may put a financial goal in front of us, and that becomes an idol because it consumes all that we are. We have that dream vacation, we have that dream home, we have that retirement amount that we want to hit. We have that big purchase that we want to make, a car or whatever it may be, and it consumes all of our time and all of our energy and all of our resources to hit that goal. And it becomes a bit of an idol for us. We can have an idol when it comes to relationships too, thinking that if you could just meet the right person, that you can love that person, they can love you back, then you will finally be complete. All the things that you are missing in your life will now be filled in. And that relationship becomes an idol. The same thing can happen for us as parents. We can turn our kids into the things that we worship by spending all of our time running them from activity to activity, by bubble wrapping them to make sure that they are not going to be injured by the world. We safeguard them to the point that nothing can touch them. And we end up spending all of our time, all of our energy on our kids. We turn them into an idol. It could be a physical idol where if I could just lose X amount of pounds, then I'll be finally perfect and I'll feel good about myself. We can worship ourself, self-indulgence, spending a lot of money on stuff we don't need and a lot of entertainment so we don't have to think about things that bother us, that cause us anxiety. And we can take these things and we can turn them into idols. But here's the thing. Even as I was going through that list, I hope you realize none of those are bad goals, but they make terrible gods. And that's what idolatry is when we take something and we turn it into God rather than take it and use it to worship God. And that's the warning that we have in the scriptures. So the question is, well, what determines that? What determines whether or not our focus in worship is really God or it's us and some of the things that we're inviting into our life to worship? Well, I think that John has a lot in this account here. And I think that when we look around this table, we can see that our worship of God is determined by where we're willing to sit in worship. It's by where we're willing to sit in worship. And I don't hear me wrong, I'm not meaning where you're physically sitting right now. I know some of you have this uncanny ability to have the same seat every week. If I asked you to move one row closer next week, it'd ruin your week. I'm not asking about the physical place you're sitting. I'm talking about the way that we see Jesus is really determined by where we're willing to sit in worship and to experience him in different ways. And so as I look around this table that John is describing here in the Gospel of John in chapter 12, I see all these different seats that he's kind of describing. The first one that I see, it's the one that's right on the surface. It's the one that you can naturally see. It's the seat of gratitude. I mean, that's the whole context of what's happening here. That they're throwing a dinner or a lunch or a meal, whatever it is, for Jesus because they just raised Lazarus from the dead. The least they could do is to put some food together. And I bet you that was probably Martha's idea, because every time we see Martha in the scriptures, she's the one who has her sleeves rolled up and she is serving. She is worshiping in the way that she is wired. So she's serving Jesus and she's bringing all the food and organizing it all together. But then you also have Mary, and Mary seems to be the one that John zooms in on here to make a very specific point. She's doing what we normally see her doing. She's sitting at the feet of Jesus. She's enjoying his presence. She's taking it all in. She's expressing her love to him. But you'll notice John starts to go throughout all these details of the gift that she brings, the way that she expresses her worship. He says that this ointment that she brings, first of all, this ointment that she brings, there's a pound of it. That's pretty close in our English translation. There's about a pound of this ointment that she brings. And so what John is doing, he's highlighting the quantity of her worship. Like it's an extravagant amount that somebody would not normally use in worship. She's going above and beyond. And that speaks a little bit to what we were just talking about in the sense that worship is not just about Sunday, and it's not just about music. There's an extravagance to it that goes above and beyond to pour out who we are onto God. The second thing we see in this is that it was expensive. That's the other adjective that John uses. There was a cost to her worship. This ointment, this nard is what it's called, it was imported from northern India. It was a very expensive thing that would be brought in. And oftentimes what would happen is the roots of this thing that they would make it out of, they would take little pieces of the pulp of those roots and it would mix it in there to give it more weight. Because it was so expensive, the more it weighed, the more you would have to pay. In this particular case, this was worth about a year's worth of wages. Can you imagine spending a year's worth of your wages on a gift for worship? That's what she did. But the other adjective that John uses here is pure. In other words, there were no pieces of that root in this thing. It was a pure worship. And that really highlights her holiness in this moment. And I think holiness is one of those things where we don't talk about it a lot because we get a little bit fearful that it gets into that realm of legalism, that we don't want it to be all about rules. And so we're careful to not talk about holiness. But that's the way that John describes what Mary is bringing here, that there's a pound of it, there's a quantity, there's a lot of it. It's extravagant, it's expensive, there's a cost to it, it's pure, it's holy. And so as you look at Mary's worship in this account, like ask yourself this, what does an extravagant version of worship look like for you? What does a version of that look like for you? There's a pastor in the early 1900s, his name is Dietrich Bonhoeffer, you maybe have heard his name before. He was in Germany, the 1900s, as the Nazi regime began to rise, and he was one of the first voices that stood up and began to speak out against Hitler and his treatment of the Jews. And ultimately, he was labeled an enemy of the state, and he had to go underground because his life was threatened. And as he went underground, he began these underground seminaries where he would train pastors and other ministry leaders. And then ultimately, at the end of the war, his life was taken from him because of his resistance. And he wrote a book, probably one of his greatest works, called The Cost of Discipleship. And in that book, he talks about discipleship, or rather, he talks about grace in a way that's really foreign to us. Listen what he says. He says, cheap grace is the deadly enemy of the church. We are fighting today for costly grace. And I know what you might be thinking. You might be thinking, well, wait, isn't the whole point of grace is that it's free? That it somewhat is cheap, like it's free for us? Well, yeah, the reality is it is free for us, but it wasn't for Jesus. It's free for us, but it wasn't for Jesus. And so what cheap grace looks like is when we receive that gift that he's given to us, that extravagant gift that he's given to us, and we do little or nothing with it. We take this gift of eternal life that he gives to us, and we do very little with it. That's what cheap grace looks like. That's the challenge that he was given to the church. And so cheap grace is when we receive that gift and we do very little with it. And if you want to know what that looks like, you can just take the other side of Mary's worship and see how that plays out. Where we'll come into worship with an unholy thinking. And an unholy thinking looks like this, that I can worship Jesus and I can still do that very thing that his word tells me not to. In other words, I can worship Jesus and I don't have to be generous. I can worship Jesus and I can do whatever I want to with my body. I can worship Jesus and fill in the blank. That's what an unholiness looks like. When we're approaching him and it looks good from the outside, but we know that there's that one thing that we're holding back. The other thing is that we confine it to our response, we confine it to a response that is small. It's a weekend response. It's a checklist. We make that idea small. It's not all about our entire lives. And so God will call us to do something. We'll say, no, don't touch that. That's mine. I'll worship you here in this area, but this is my area. So we'll confine it. And the third one is it doesn't cost us anything. That worship in the end doesn't cost us anything. And if there's one thing I could see about all of this faith and worship and following Jesus in the scriptures, it's this, that if your faith doesn't cost you anything, it isn't worth anything. There's a reason why so much of faith in the scriptures is tied to the idea of sacrifice, of giving up certain things to chase the ultimate thing, of giving up, yes, bad things, but even giving up good things, knowing that God is the greatest thing. And so there's an element of sacrifice that we're called to, that worship should cost us something. It should cost us something. And so if your faith doesn't cost you anything, it isn't worth anything. And so when you sit in this seat of gratitude, there's an element of sacrifice that needs to happen. And listen, just so you hear me clearly, for a Christian, the sacrifice is not earning you anything. It's not earning you God's love. It's not earning salvation. It's not earning you his favor. You're already loved. And if you've given your life to him, you're already saved. But sacrifice instead is about obedience. It's about trust. It's about trusting that he knows better and he wants the best for you. And so even if it doesn't make sense to you, you still say, yes, I'm going to follow you in your ways and do what you tell me. So what does worship cost you? Like really, like let that question kind of sink in for a little bit. What does worship cost you? And I think if you have a hard time right now even thinking about what that answer is, then maybe you need to think about the seat you're sitting in and reevaluate how you approach Jesus, how you see Jesus, depending on the seat that you're willing to sit in. Because worship should have a cost. There's another seat that I see at the table, and this one has really kind of drawn me in a lot lately, where I'm looking at Lazarus, like not just even the funny moment of him sitting there a little shell-shocked, but I'm looking at Lazarus and I realize he's not saying anything, but man, is he saying a lot. There's something to Lazarus that just really grabs my attention here, because I want you to think about the context of this meal. He was just dead yesterday. And now he's sitting at this table, reclining at this table with Jesus. And there's something about his presence that communicates so much to the people around the table and even to us all these thousands of years later. I want you to realize the context of what's about to happen, because Lazarus, yes, he's just been raised from the dead. And as soon as the local religious leaders hear this, what do? They start to plot to get after Jesus and to kill Jesus. But they don't stop there. They actually go after Lazarus as well. Listen what John records a little bit later. He says this in John 12, verse 9 through 11. He said, when the large crowd of the Jews learned that Jesus was there, they came, not only on account of him, but also to see Lazarus, whom he had raised from the dead. So the chief priests made plans to put Lazarus to death as well, because on account of him, many of the Jews were going away and believing in Jesus. Did you know there's a murder plot out on Lazarus right now? That's the context of this meal. And what do we see this guy doing? He's just chilling at the table. Like he's not pacing around the room, worried about things. It says he's reclining at the table. He's just hanging out with Jesus. There's like such a peace and such a confidence about this guy that he has no worries in what's happening right now. No worries at all. He's hearing these rumors of things that are happening. What's that? People are out to kill me? Oh, have you seen what this guy does to death? I'm good. Well, let's eat. Are you guys okay? I'm good. He's just reclining at the table. And that peace that he has, that presence that he has, speaks volumes to that room. And it should speak volumes to us as well. That level of confidence is something that we're called to have if we're a follower of Jesus. You know, in Galatians, Paul talks about this. In Galatians 2:20, he says that we've been crucified with Christ if we're in him. We've already died. The life we live, we now live in the flesh. Or rather, the life we live, we don't live in the flesh. We live by faith in the Son of God who loved us and gave his life for us. We've already died that death. The ultimate death can't touch us. And so there's a level of confidence that we should have as we go about and we interact with people. and we invite people into our homes, or we invite them to a meal out to lunch or whatever it may be, there's a level of confidence that should spread throughout the room that looks different than the world around us. In my mind, Lazarus is the perfect picture of Psalm 23, famous psalm that says this: "You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies." He's got no worries. The enemies are right outside the door, and he's just hanging out with Jesus. He is the picture of what the Christian life will be, that after death, we're in the presence of Jesus, Jesus as the host of the table. And that's what this has to do with the table. You see, there are moments in the scriptures that describe heaven, and some of the most beautiful moments are a description of a table. Listen to what it says in Revelation 19. It says, "The angel said to me," this is John later in life, "Write this: Blessed are those who are invited to the marriage supper of the Lamb. And he said to me, these are the true words of God." So heaven is this picture of a celebration. Like, throw away harps and clouds and all that silliness. You're not turning into an angel. You're getting to sit at the table of Jesus. Heaven is a party. It's a feast. It's a celebration around a table. Jesus is the host. Listen what he said a little bit later in Luke's gospel. He says this to his disciples. He says, "You are those who have stayed with me in my trials, and I assign to you, as my Father assigned to me, a kingdom, that you may eat and drink at my table in my kingdom and sit on thrones judging the 12 tribes of Israel." So as Jesus is trying to paint a picture of what heaven is like for his disciples, he says, there's going to be a table. It's mine. I'm the host, and it's going to be a feast. And from that table, we're going to rule. And heaven's going to be beautiful. And he paints this picture over and over of a table in heaven. So what does that have to do with us? Well, do you remember how Jesus taught us how to pray? The Lord's Prayer. He said that what is in heaven should be on earth. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. So if heaven is painted as this picture of this beautiful table, shouldn't there be a little piece of that here? As we care for people, as we invite people into our homes, there should be a little piece of that here, that they should be able to experience that. They should be able to experience that they come into our homes, and no matter what the circumstances are in our life right now, we're not afraid because we know who holds all things ultimate in his hands. We're not pacing the room. We're not participating with a lot of the darkness that's happening in the world right now. There's a calmness to us. There's a stillness. There's something about our lives that is a witness to the power of Jesus. That we were once dead and now we're alive and we're in his presence. And we're filled with confidence and we're filled with hope. You see, if people were to come around our tables, what kind of stories would they be hearing about the seats that we're willing to sit in? Gratitude, witness? Would they be experiencing Jesus through us? So one of the things we wanted to do in this series, though, we don't want to just talk about this. We don't want to just tell stories about the table from the Gospels. We want to challenge everybody to get people into your homes like we're talking about. So we've got a couple resources, and I wanted to mention them here real quick. One is we have a host guide that we put on our app because we recognize that not everybody knows how to do this, and this may not be comfortable territory for everybody to do, to invite people into your homes. So we're trying to break down those barriers. In this app, you will find all kinds of stuff from a fancier dinner all the way to a pizza party, a bonfire. There's activities for kids, there's liturgies, there's prayers, there's all kinds of great stuff on there. So please get on our app, check it out. Great resource to start. The second thing is that all of our locations, what we wanted to do, we want to make this visible. We want you to not only be doing it as an individual, but we want to see collectively what this looks like across our campuses. So every location is going to have a visible element of this in their lobbies, that as you have meals in your homes, you're going to be able to participate in that. And so your host is going to have details on what that looks like for your particular location. But I want you to take advantage of those, because as we hear these stories, we don't want to just leave them as stories and say, well, that was good. We want to roll up our sleeves. We want to invite people into our homes. We want to have these conversations of hope around our tables about Jesus. We want to worship him through gratitude. And we want to allow people to see us through that witness lens, that we're willing to share who Jesus is to us and what impact he's made on our lives as well. So why does this matter? Why am I talking about these various seats around the table? Well, I think there's like a contagious element to what's going on in this story that we see with John. If you'll notice this detail in verse 3, he says this: the house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. I don't think that's a passing detail. I think that John put that in there on purpose. I think that every time John smelled that smell, after this moment, it took him right back to that room and right around that table. You know how smells will do that to you, right? They'll transport you through time. They'll get you back on a different memory. I think that's what John is experiencing here when he remembers in that moment the fragrance of that perfume filling the house. There's an element to what Mary is doing here that's contagious. It's filling up everybody's senses in this moment. And God really tells us that kind of connection happens in our lives when we begin to worship Jesus with all that we are. There's an element of that happens in our own lives. Listen to how Paul describes this. He says, "Thanks be to God, who in Christ always leads us in triumphal procession, and through us spreads the fragrance of the knowledge of him everywhere. For we are the aroma of Christ to God among those who are being saved and among those who are perishing. To one, fragrance from death to death, to the other, a fragrance from life to life. Who is sufficient for these things?" So Paul talks about the fact that when we enter into a space, there should be a difference. There should be something that maybe they couldn't put their finger on, but there's a difference there. And this procession that he's talking about, it's the image of a Roman parade that when they would go and they would have a battle and have great victory, they didn't have the internet, they didn't have social media, they didn't have news, so things traveled slow. And the way that they would announce this is they would go from town to town to town, and they would throw these giant parades announcing their victory. And so people would visually see this parade coming into town, but they wouldn't just do that. They would go ahead of this parade, and they would spread incense throughout the streets. So they couldn't only see the victory, they would smell the victory. And Paul is talking about that here when he says that when you enter into a room, there should be something different. There should be something different in the air that maybe they can't identify in the moment, but there's something different about you. And that's the comparison of you and I when we worship with our lives, not just with a Sunday experience or not just with a music experience. We don't always have to be saying something. Sometimes it's just the way we live our lives that communicates so much to the world around us and to those around our tables. But I'll warn you, I'm going to give this warning, especially to you people pleasers. If you are people pleasers, I was going to make you raise your hands because I knew you would do it to make me happy. I'm not going to do that. But if you're a people pleaser, just know not everybody likes this. Like you heard it in the end of his passage. For some, this is a fragrance of life. There's something different, there's something beautiful, and they're attracted to it. But for others, they're not. It's a fragrance of death. It's not appealing. And that shouldn't change the way that we interact. It shouldn't change the way that we worship. But it's an important point to note here because at this table, there's a third seat. Not just gratitude, not just witness, there's a third seat here. And it's what I would call the seat of scoffers. And I know that's not a word that we would normally use these days, but that's the word that the Bible uses for somebody who's always critical, who always has a critical lens on the world. In particular, they have a critical lens when it comes to other people's faith. The book of Psalms starts off with that word. Psalm 1, verse 1, this is what it says. "Blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the wicked, nor stands in the way of sinners, nor sits in the seat of scoffers. But his delight is in the law of the Lord, and on his law he meditates day and night." And so a scoffer, it's not merely a critic, it's somebody who's critical of another person's faith. And I know what you might be thinking. You might be thinking, well, that's not the seat that I sit in. Like I'm not a scoffer, I'm not a critic. But I think that there's like a nuance to this seat that the Western church really struggles with. And it all has to do with preference. It all has to do with preference. So for us in the Reilly household, if you were here a handful of weeks ago, I told you about our table. It's all beat up, it's dented, it's got a lot of life in it with 4 kids. The reality is that we moved about a year and a half ago, and that table doesn't even fit in our space. And so we've been kind of living off of a bit of a temporary setup. And I'll be honest, when we first moved in, I looked pretty hard to find something that fit our room and fit our style, but over time I just kind of stopped. I got a little slow with it. I wasn't looking at anything. This series really pushed me forward because I can't stay up here and talk about a table and not have one. So I went out, I actually bought one. I found a table for our space. We put it in last week. Set up similar, 4 chairs. There's a bench to it as well. The bench is kind of up against a wall in our home. What was really interesting with a new space and a new table, it was interesting to watch everybody kind of jockey for different chairs because we didn't have anything established in this new place. And so who's going to sit where? It depends. I want a chair at the end, or I want to sit on the bench, depending on who else is sitting on the bench. I want a chair that's maybe not my back to the island that's happening there. So everybody's kind of moving around. There was a little tension, maybe some crying. I got over it, but then we all figured out our chairs. And I think sometimes when it comes to worship, that's the way that we operate, isn't it? We operate primarily out of the question, what works for me? Like, what seat do I want to sit in is based on what works particularly for me. And what ends up happening is we kind of develop a bit of a spiritual Goldilocks syndrome, where we go through all the options trying to make sure it's a fit for me. Well, I didn't like that sermon because it was too soft. I didn't like that volunteer opportunity because it was just too much. I didn't like that spiritual discipline because it was too hard. I didn't like that small group because it was too shallow. I didn't like that small group because it was too deep. And we start to wrestle through and we opt out to not worship and not respond to God because we're looking for the perfect fit all the time. We're trying to play Goldilocks in our spiritual lives and we miss out because we're all trying to figure out what seat works best for me rather than just sitting in the seats that God tells us to sit in when it comes to worship. Worship becomes about preference. It's not about our gratitude to Him. It's not about our witness to others. It's about us. It becomes about me. It's about preference. Francis Chan, a pastor that many of you have probably heard his name before. I love this. Years ago, he said that there was a woman who came up to him after the service and she said, "Pastor, I really didn't like worship today." And before she could even share any details, he said, "That's okay. We weren't worshiping you." I love that. That's a strong statement. Here's why this matters. Here's why we have to guard about this. Because just like Mary's perfume is starting to spread throughout this home, there's another element that's starting to spread here. And this is how John continues that chapter 12, right after he talks about Mary's perfume filling the home. He says this, "But Judas Iscariot, one of his disciples, he who was about to betray him, said, 'Why was this ointment not sold for 300 denarii and given to the poor?' He said this not because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief, and having charge of the money bag, he used to help himself to what was put in it. And Jesus said, 'Leave her alone, so that she may keep it for the day of my burial. For the poor you always have with you, but you do not always have me.'" And she does this extravagant, this beautiful moment of worship. And Judas raises his hands and he starts to object. And notice how he frames this objection. He's scoffing at her for her extravagant faith, but he does it with a lot of righteous language. He's saying, "Well, what about the poor?" And as I was thinking about this week, I thought, you know what? Judas probably could have taken a lot of Old Testament references, which was what they had access to back then, and he could have backed up his position. He could have had a strong case for what he just said. He's not wrong. Like, what about the poor? He could have backed it up. And I think that that's why what he said was so contagious in that room. See, John doesn't have a detail that Matthew and Mark, they keep in there. It says the other disciples begin to ask the same question. So Judas, as he points this out, it begins to rise up in the others saying, "Yeah, well, wait a minute, what about this?" So this kind of scoffer, this critical attitude that Judas has, that begins to rise up through the room. It begins to become contagious with them as well. Just like Mary's worship, his objection begins to spread. You see how this begins to spread, and so does his objection. I mean, why do you think we're so quick to do what I was talking about earlier, where we'll take the things that God gives to us, and instead of worshiping Him, we'll worship them in and of themselves? Why do you think we're so quick to do that? What causes us to go after relationships or financial goals or career goals or whatever it may be and worship those things instead? What causes us to worship those instead of God? Well, I think just one word could be put in there. I think it's the word trust. I think there's a lack of trust when it comes to God, and that's why we pull away in certain areas. Do you notice what Jesus said here at the end? Maybe you kind of missed it, read through it fast, but He says, "You'll always have the poor with you." It's an odd thing to say, right? I mean, if He is God, and if He is powerful, all-powerful, if He's loving, You've heard that argument before. Why doesn't he get rid of poverty? Why is Jesus saying, well, the poor will always be here? And that's a big part of worship. That's a big question for you to answer. Can you worship a God who, fill in the blank? Can you worship a God that doesn't end poverty? Can you worship a God who doesn't end war that displaces thousands of people in their homes? Can you worship a God that allows cancer to enter into the body of a child? Can you worship a God who doesn't prevent natural disasters? Can you worship a God who, fill in the blank with whatever you want? If you answer no to any of that, then what you're really saying is, God, I want to sit at the head of the table. Because you're not doing things the way that I think they should be done, I can't trust you. Because you're not giving the outcome that I want, I'll worship you, but it's going to be on my terms. And so there's an element of trust to all this, that we don't get to know those answers. We don't get to know the why. He never said he was going to give us those answers on this side. So there's an element of trust that yes, he is sovereign, he is powerful, he's loving, he's our Father, he wants the best for us. Sometimes things don't make sense. But that's okay because you're not sitting at the head of the table. He is. And so there's an element of trust, not trust in what your senses tell you or your own understanding, but there's an element of trusting that he does, that the one who you trust has it all figured out. And one day it's going to be a beautiful celebration in heaven around a table. But I think that's what holds us back. I think there's a lack of trust when it comes to worship. And I think that's the bit of the warning that Judas serves for us as John pans this camera around. It might seem like he's at the right table, like he is in the right place this whole time. I mean, think about all that he's gotten to experience over 3 years. He was there when thousands were fed. He got to hold the bread in his hands and maybe even share it out himself and be a part of the team that brought in the baskets. He was there when Jesus walked on water, and he got to see that with his own eyes. He was there whenever the water was turned into wine. He probably got to taste some of it. He was there for all the teachings. He was there for all the parables. He heard all these. In an outsider's view, Judas was at the right table, but he was sitting in the wrong seat. And I think he serves as a warning for all of us that just because we may get in this room on a regular basis, it doesn't mean that we're seeing Jesus in the right light, that we're truly worshiping him, responding to his goodness in all these ways. So I think if Lazarus is a picture of Psalm 23, I think that Judas then becomes a picture of Isaiah 29. I've been thinking about this verse a lot this week. God says that there's an element of people that will draw near with their mouth and honor me with their lips while their hearts are far from me. Judas sat at the table of Jesus, and he completely missed him because he was sitting in the wrong seat. He didn't worship with an air of gratitude. He didn't use his life and his story as a witness to share with others. It was all about himself. What can I get out of this? And I think that's the big difference that we see here between Judas and all the rest of them at this table. As that camera spins around, we see Judas who just sees Jesus as a means to an end. What can I get out of this guy? But everybody else sees Jesus as the end of their searching, the end of their sin, the end of their shame. They see him as everything. And so they're willing to sit in the seat of gratitude so that they see their lives as an opportunity to worship him. And no cost is too great. No ask from God is too great. And their entire lives they're living in light of the cross for them to come for us in history. They're willing to sit in the seat of witness knowing that their story matters, their presence matters, their steadiness, because they trust in God, it matters. And this worship, it's an act of humility. It's not about them, just like it's not about us. But many sit in the seat of scoffers where the vision is limited, and all you can see is what you want to see. And so you never grow. You never mature in Christian faith. You only see Jesus, or you see the Bible, or you see the church through the lens of a critic. So God calls us to sit in the seat of humility. He calls us to sit in the seat of gratitude. He calls us to sit in this seat of love and grace and all the things that he calls us to so that we can respond to him in a beautiful thing called worship. And I think that that's what John is giving us a picture of as he pans around this table here in his gospel. So that's my hope, that as we gather people around our tables, that they'll hear the same. They'll hear stories of healing in our own lives, stories of hope for them, stories of challenge for them. It's a beautiful invitation to be a part of this. Let me pray for us. Father, we thank you that you do call us to sacrifice, that there is a cost to when we worship. That yes, your salvation and your grace, it is free, but it was not cheap for you. And so in light of that love that you give to us, may we respond deeply. May we respond with gratitude. May we respond by being obedient to your call to share our lives into the world and be the fragrance of Christ as we go about our days. We thank you, we love you, and we praise you in the name of Jesus. Amen.